So good morning, and let me be the first to wish you a happy Shark Week. If you haven't been paying attention, Discovery Channel is all sharks all the time this week. Hopefully this will be at least as interesting to you. I'm Norman Beer, directing the Open Learning Initiative at Carnegie Mellon. I've had at least a few people ask so far, what's Carnegie Mellon doing at a conference devoted to learning with MOOCs? Because in many ways, we've been staying out of the MOOC game, sometimes very loudly. And so, in some ways, I think this will be an answer, that we're not sitting completely outside of the MOOC space, but instead we're doing a lot of work that we believe can very effectively complement much of the access and the research that's happening through MOOCs. How many of you know what the Open Learning Initiative is? Well, fantastic. Then my next few slides can go pretty quickly. Missed one. So the Open Learning Initiative is an ongoing research project at Carnegie Mellon. Our focus has been the integration of learning science with technology to build effective online learning environments that can simultaneously enact instruction for students and improve our understanding of human learning. So the way that we approach this has been through a very careful design process on the front end, starting off with a look at student-centered measurable learning outcomes and thinking carefully with a team about how we can build learning activities that will support students in achieving those ends. We've been doing this work since 2002, and our original charge had been to focus on enacting learning for independent students, independent learners. What we discovered pretty quickly was that this kind of careful approach to design can also create materials that can be exceptionally valuable in the hands of experienced faculty. And so our charge changed fairly quickly. We now look to support better learning and also better instruction, both through the creation of learning materials, but also through the creation of tools to support that instruction. We share our courses openly and freely, and this sharing serves a number of purposes. One of them, from our original charge, has been to support an access agenda. But we also think that this sharing feeds directly into this larger mission that we have of improving our understanding of how people learn. The larger a population we have participating in our courses, the more we're able to learn from them. When we talk about designing an OLI course, folks often think that we're just talking about a technology, but instead we're talking about an entire approach to developing learning experiences. What we want to incorporate straight off from the beginning is science. Both the science of learning in terms of how this influences how we craft our learning experiences, but also on the back end as we engage in very regular and thoughtful considerations of how effective these designs have been. We recognize that we don't know everything about how to build effective learning experiences, and so much of the work that we do represent a hypothesis on how we can help students achieve specific learning outcomes. And if we're going to be honest, we need to take that step back and consider how well did we do? And quite frequently, we'll need to step back and say that hypothesis wasn't quite right. The technology is obviously important, but equally important is a team-based approach. And we think this is one of the things that really distinguishes our work from some of the other efforts to move learning online. That we're not looking to take a faculty member's course online. We instead take that faculty member and work with other content experts and other experts in learning science, in educational technology, in user experience, bring them together and really be thoughtful about how we apply those different expertises to craft a learning experience that focuses on these outcomes. In addition to the team-based approach, we are a little bit fanatical about data capture. And I know that it's popular to talk about the large gobs of data that you're gathering at this point. And so I'm happy to give you the big numbers of the data that we capture. But I think the important points about data capture within an OLI course is that we've been able to fairly carefully instrument this data and wrap it in some semantic context. So it's not just that I've got some large amount of clickstream information, but I can start to say some things about those clicks and what they represent with regard to the kinds of outcomes we were trying to achieve. This data is used in a lot of different ways, and probably most crucially, it's to give feedback to the learner. But equally important, we give feedback to the instructor population. We use the information to guide iterative course improvement. And finally, we're using this information to try to advance our understanding of how people learn. Some of the work that I'm going to be talking about today will end up crossing the line between these, most particularly between improved course design and improved science of learning. So When we think about the outputs of this, one of the ones that's best known is the OLI Learning Dashboard. So sitting underneath many of our courses is a cognitive model that's going to be making estimates based on student performance against our activities on how well they have achieved these learning outcomes, gives faculty members a chance to quickly identify where their class seems to be doing well, where they need additional support, and then allow them to drill in and identify more carefully what are the misconceptions that seem to be really causing students problems, and allow them to spend their instructional time drilling in on those areas. This also gives us some pretty interesting behind-the-scenes data in estimating how well students are learning across these different skills and these different learning objectives, though. We've been fairly successful, and if you've heard about OLI, most likely I don't need to dive into some of the past research studies. Maybe more importantly, you're not in this room to hear about the past work. So what is this project with regard to the MOOCs? Where did it come from? It actually comes out of an earlier project called the Community College Open Learning Initiative. Our goal with CCOLI was to take some of the work that we've been doing and really take a much deeper dive into the community college space. This was partnering with faculty and experts in community colleges to identify 4 gatekeeper courses, 2 of which we'd already done some work on, 2 of which were new. We wanted to build these out to address the needs of the community college population and see if we could really improve effectiveness in these courses where we know that students struggle. One of these courses is psychology. And in participating in the development of the course, we looked not just for community college faculty, but also for other interested domain experts. And one of those came to us from Georgia Tech. At about the time that our course was wrapping up, and finally I get to the meat of this story, Georgia Tech decided that they were going to be delivering a MOOC on psychology. So this was about the time, late 2012, early 2013, that the Gates Foundation had put out a fairly large call for offering 100 to 200 level MOOCs and drilling in on the evaluation side of this. How effective are they in terms of the population that the foundation was trying to reach? In talking with Georgia Tech, we felt like they had some ideas for how they wanted to deliver this MOOC. They also recognized that they just participated in building this fabulous resource, the OLI psychology course. And so together we decided that they were going to offer the MOOC, but offer it using this OLI course. And this ended up leaving a fairly clean set of responsibilities both for each party but also for each system. And so from the student perspective, they were signing on to the MOOC platform. Within the MOOC platform, they were getting video lectures, they were participating in discussion forums. They were also using LTI to get sent over to work through OLI modules. In our original vision, the faculty member was going to be then reviewing the learning dashboard and using this to guide the video lectures that he'd be recording. Turned out that that was a little overly ambitious and was expecting a little too much turnaround time. So they ended up using the dashboard to guide instruction and support inside of the discussion forums. What this got us is some very rich data sets. So on the side of the MOOC, we have the traditional clickstream information, particularly representing these video interactions, high-stakes assessments, and a separate data set around discussion. Within the OLI side, we have our learning interaction data set, and this has actually now been loaded into DataShop and is available for folks to take a look at, and a separate data set that we call our evaluation report. We've got lots and lots of information, and this has given us the chance to just start scratching the surface on understanding how can the use of these kinds of carefully designed learning environments be used in the MOOC context. It also gave us some really interesting possibilities for comparison, because in addition to the use in the MOOC context, we have an R1 institution that was using this exact same MOOC in teaching their students. So we have a classroom-based MOOC. And finally, around the Community College Open Learning Initiative, we've got a large population of students that have used OLI in different face-to-face contexts, but with similar demographics. Also interesting, we have some pre- and post-test data that is common across the MOOC and the CCOLI. We had permission from the College Board to use the AP Psychology test, or a selection from it, as our pre-post measures. So when I was walking in here, one of my colleagues was looking at my slide deck and saying, "Norman, you really need to kill your darlings here. This is way too long." And I'm looking at the clock and I'm cognizant that he was right. I'm going to be moving through some of these pieces fairly quickly so that we can get to the discussion point. If I start moving too quickly, throw something at me or make a note so that we can come back to it. So this is a fairly important point. What we've been trying to dig into are evidence of effectiveness and evidence of learning. And despite some rumors to the contrary, we believe there are some ways to measure these things, that we can say some meaningful things about them. Within the context of these data sets, these are some of the ways that we've considered both effectiveness and learning. The third-party assessment instrument in this case is the AP pre- and post-test. But we also feel that we've got some fairly reliable high-stakes activities, both in the MOOC and inside of OLI. Completion was interesting, although mostly only useful for our CCOLI set. And finally, these OLI learning estimates, we feel, tell us some interesting things about the interaction between activities in the OLI context and the activities on the MOOC context. Things that I want to talk about: what can I say about inside the MOOC? What can I say in those comparisons? I'll probably be skipping these new approaches for iterative improvement. Other areas of research, I've got someone that can talk a bit about when we get into the facilitation side of things, challenges and future steps. I'd also like to give credit to the cadre of grad students that were really essential in prepping this data set for me. I cannot claim full credit for this, and Jihi Kim in particular has been really important, so give credit where it's due. This is what a typical week in the MOOC looked like. Students were given a series of videos and then sent over to work through a set of OLI modules. They could work through this at their own pace, and they would eventually return by the end of the week to take a quiz inside of the MOOC. Some of the early research questions we wanted to understand: what was the impact of OLI on dropout rates? What was this comparison on pre-post? And is there any difference in terms of using OLI in overall performance? What we discovered is that, yes, in fact, engaging with the OLI activities seems to correlate with a lesser dropout rate, but this makes sense when you think about the larger MOOC context. We also saw that engaging with the activities had a real and significant effect on the post-test score. In this case, this was an exam that was administered inside of the Coursera system. There's a lot of information that we can dive into to talk about differences in demographics, and I'm going to come back to this. In this case, we were trying to consider performance on the Coursera quizzes, both with and without use of the OLI activities. Summarize that fairly quickly. What we discovered wasn't completely shocking, that the kinds of occupations and people that you would expect tended to do a little better. We didn't see age having much of an impact, but we were a little surprised at the gender distinction. What was most interesting, though, is really considering how do we drive success, or what kinds of activities and work should we be recommending students to engage in. And we were comparing some very basic measures of use of OLI against success on relevant quizzes. What we saw here is a pretty close relationship between success and engaging with the learning activities. There's obviously some relationship as well with simply taking a look at the pages. And so what we'd be recommending to students based on this is, yeah, it's good to go in and read this stuff, but if you really want to get some value, go in and carefully engage in the learning activities that have been constructed. Looking at the comparative information, first, the top is the MOOC, the bottom is CCOLI. We're looking at age, and clearly we have a much younger population engaged in the community college work. Similarly, we're looking at degrees now: PhDs, masters, bachelors, associates, and high school. So I guess my first question here is, what are all of you people doing taking an Introduction to Psychology MOOC? Because that's who was predominantly showing up for this Intro to Psych piece. And I think it had a pretty tremendous impact on the results. Drilling in on these learning estimate questions, interestingly, we end up seeing fairly similar patterns between our MOOC students and our community college students. And this really starts to come out when we look into how many activities they participated in. And so we end up breaking that out by 25% jumps. Finally, when we look at the early use of activities between CCOLI and our MOOC students, we're seeing that, especially in the early phase, even doing a little bit on the activity side seems to lead to improved learning gain amongst the community college students. But when we move into this space of engaging actively against all of the activities, this balances out. Again, we don't see huge distinctions between our MOOC and our community college student performance. Pre-post test, however, we saw a much different set of information. And so clearly the MOOC students were coming in at a higher level and they were achieving higher learning gains. This is using the AP exam. We drilled in a little deeper because I think the place that this is most interesting is within the high school population, so students that have finished high school and do not have a degree. Even there, we've ended up seeing some distinctions that were frankly a little surprising, and just sort of scratching the surface on this, so I don't have a great explanation on it. Within CCOLI and within the MOOC, we also want to look at the impact of engaging with learning activities on post-test results and pre-test results. What you see here is not surprising on the CCOLI side. Engage with the activities and you're going to do better on the post-test. But you see a much more interesting pattern on the MOOC side. And again, one that I don't have a fantastic explanation for except to sort of look at the population that I have engaged. Beyond these early explorations, these data sets have also allowed us to look at some other areas of research. One of them has been work in data analysis between different data sets. I'm actually going to let Carolyn address that in just a minute. We've also been able to use this MOOC data to drill in more deeply on iterative improvement questions. The Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center team has been looking at our MOOC data to identify places where we're not getting very good learning curves and try to address this by identifying outcomes that we can both build richer learning activities, but also move the learning outcome a little more towards something higher on Bloom's taxonomy. So moving from some simple questions to things that are a bit more scenario-based. Some of the challenges in doing this work, matching between students and dealing with dropout rates, and this is the bane of any MOOC research, so I'm not telling you anything new here. Data sharing agreements have been a real challenge, and in part this is because of the sheer number of IRB protocols with which we've needed to engage. Logistics of making all of this work, just setting up appropriate systems, making the OLI system available. So all of these things have made the research pretty challenging, and if I were to go back and do it again, and hopefully I will be, some of these I'm going to try to get in front of, particularly on the data sharing side. I think that this has been one of the places where we ended up putting in a lot of effort and finding out on the back end that some components we couldn't be sharing. Future directions, lots more information to analyze. We've just had this same MOOC run a second time, and what we're really hoping to do is repeat these kinds of experiments with other courses. Obviously, the psychology has been interesting and fairly successful, but we've got a lot of other courses that we think could be used to support MOOCs in interesting ways. So when we talk about the facilitated discussion piece, obviously happy to take any questions and go back and look at some of the box plots that I flew through. But I think probably more interesting for some of our time here is to consider, not just within OLI, but more broadly, how can we move towards more common measures of learning and effectiveness so that we don't always feel like we've got to come up here and make it up or defend the decisions that we've made? How can we more carefully integrate these kinds of designed activities into the MOOC experience? And finally, more broadly, how do we better facilitate these kinds of research and evaluation questions, whether this is integrating it into the design of a course, whether it's accounting for IRB challenges before the work gets started, and how do we facilitate this data sharing with a nod to appropriate concerns for learner and educator privacy. So I've gone 5 minutes over my allocated 15, and I've thrown an awful lot of information at you. But before I open it up for questions, I actually wanted to introduce Carolyn Rosé. So I was very excited to bring these data sets together and immediately began running around campus saying, who wants to do some research? And Carolyn was the first one to stand up. So Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been able to do with the data sets?
Sure. So I'll just mention three briefly areas of work that my group has been doing and then let people ask follow-up questions if they're interested. One has been a lot of analyses of discussion data. I'm a language technologies professor, and so we've been looking at those discussions to see what kinds of things can we actually detect about students that might help us to develop interventions to support especially students who seem like they're at risk of dropping out. So we've looked at things like motivation, cognitive engagement, social connectedness, attitudes towards the course, confusion. So that's one line of research. Another is that we have been developing interventions themselves and making them easy to deploy in MOOCs in an edX context or a Coursera context. We've been working with this LTI protocol. It was very easy to do that wrapper, so we think we could also integrate our interventions in other platforms as well. And that includes support for small group collaborative learning activities, as well as for interventions to help people get connected in the threaded discussions, looking for ways of matching help seekers and help providers. But a third area, which really kind of dovetails on the keynote talk from this morning, is that I've really been pushing, and also in my new role as president-elect of the International Society of the Learning Sciences, to get more crosstalk between communities, getting the technology people and the learning scientists really to work in close partnership. And as part of that, I'm organizing a workshop that Norm mentioned, where we're using the psychology MOOC data as a shared data set to get teams from various different universities to apply their modeling techniques. It's at a machine learning conference to see what they can understand about the data. And in order to get a discussion going between people who are strong on modeling but might not know what questions they should be asking with their models or how to interpret their models, and in the context of that workshop at this conference, where we expect that a lot of the contribution will be from computer scientists, that we'll have keynote talks from learning scientists who will talk about their perspective on the data, what they see, and what questions they would ask. And we hope then that that will really start to get some of these really deep partnerships going that we need in this community in order to really push things forward. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. So even within this individual data set and even within this individual experience, there's still plenty more to dig into. But I'd really like to throw out here a call to action, because I think one of the most important parts of the original OLI mission was and continues to be this notion of making these materials openly available and seeing them used in a variety of contexts. A barrier to this that we've never been able to leap, at least not perfectly, has been getting around the not invented here syndrome. The notion that we've got these carefully designed full course experiences that could then be integrated into other contexts, whether it's MOOC or classroom, just opens up so many possibilities and doors, and yet we don't see the engagement with it that we would have hoped for and that we expect. I think we were very fortunate in the psychology context, because we had some engagement with this institution and with the participants, and they recognized that, yes, here's a course that we've helped to design. We know that it can support work in our MOOC. It has the appropriate open licensing to make this easy. How do I convince the rest of you that we've got all of these great resources, and how can we work together to take the resources that have been built and instead focus our attention on building new things that are going to leverage that? And this isn't just a question for the MOOC research, I think, but is really one of the long-standing questions in the open education community. Sorry, that was more of a sermon than a question. I apologize. It started as a question. Let me turn it over to you. What questions do you have? Yes?
I just have a quick couple of questions. Hi, I'm Catherine Hicks from UCSD, and I had a couple of quick questions about the data. So one is that, you have some interesting effects, especially like the gender thing. Are there any interaction effects between all those things? And if so, like any big ones? Or are you still puzzling that out?
We're still puzzling it out, and part of this is, the other challenge has been how many students we actually get answering the demographic survey information. And so those places where things have been rich enough to really drill in on interaction effects, the effect of education and occupation in this has been so overpowering that finding a smaller population has been challenging. On the CCOLI side, I think we do a little bit of a better job of teasing out what some of those interaction effects are. There's a pretty decent write-up of this. It's been published on the OLI site. It's also available on the Hewlett Foundation's website called the CCOLI Evaluation Report.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah. And the other quick data question was when you were talking about analyzing discussion stuff, and I assume that that's very much like the natural language kind of. Yeah. So so you mentioned all of these. Were any of them predictive? Are you still looking at that? Yeah. So which were?
Predictions were exactly what you would expect. Students who are confused are, that's associated with higher dropout. But what's kind of interesting is that actually exposure to other confused students was much stronger in its effect than actually students who express confusion themselves. So students who are around, a lot of students who are expressing confusion have a 45% higher dropout rate. We also see that social connectedness is really important. It's not surprising that students who've made more connections stay in longer, but what's interesting is that when the people who they've connected with start to drop out, they are much more likely, almost twice as likely, to drop out. That varies a little bit between classes. We always see the effect, the strength varies a little bit. We also see students who are more cognitively engaged have a lower dropout rate. So it's a lot of the things that you would expect, but the important thing is that we can detect changes within a student's attitude or whatever over time, and so we can start to see those places where they look like they're vulnerable, and if there are limited resources for offering support, we can target the students who are at risk at the time when they're at risk, and hopefully that will allow us to have more impact. So I just want to say very briefly that only a small proportion of students actually participate in the discussions, so that only allows us to monitor a small proportion of the students. But what we're doing now is looking for connections between how people express themselves in the discussion forums and the patterns, routines, and practices that we see in the clickstream data. And the hope is then that we can get more insight into what those clickstream patterns mean from the discussion data for that small proportion of students who participate, and then we can project out that ability to see those things in the clickstream data to the students who don't participate in the discussions.
Can I just really quickly ask too, it seems like, it's such an interesting problem. Does it trouble you, or do you make this distinction between the fact that these students are all talking to each other, and together makes it almost difficult to figure out what is the unit, that you're analyzing, right? And in the individual student unit, considering that they're part of actually a conversation, somebody could argue that that's not really the unit. Really, the unit is just this whole forum or something like that. How do you puzzle that out?
I think that those are questions that we are considering, and we're looking at models that explore different units of analysis. And pass it to sorry. Sorry about that. So we're definitely considering those questions. They're complicated questions. We don't have a pat answer, but we totally acknowledge that's good thinking. So it looks like Neil back there has a question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Neil Leffman from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I don't think I need the mic. My question is actually, so you did this cool stuff to actually make LTI actually work, right, through edX. And I know Dave Pritchard there actually had a postdoc yesterday talk about actually using I thought he was doing the LTI. So what's probably many people in the room that have other little objects they'd like to integrate into their courses, just like you guys actually integrated your stuff. Can you say a little bit more about actually how difficult that was? Is there code available that edX can actually help other people actually do this? We're right in the middle we just got funded for a project to actually do the LTI integration for edX, because we have all this math content that we want to actually be able to be available. And so, and also, can you address the issue that LTI actually allows you to pull down rosters, but also push back up data? And is edX ready to actually accept data back up? Yeah.
So first, quick correction. We actually did this with the Coursera system. I've been begging some folks at edX to try the same stunt in an edX course, and we've got a couple possibilities there. On the LTI side, I think that this who knows what LTI is before I start diving in? Half of you. So LTI is a standard for making learning objects and learning tools interoperable. And you can think of needing to have two pieces of implementation on LTI. As a tool provider, I need to provide mechanisms so that others can plug into my tool, pass me appropriate information, and get information back. As a tool consumer, and this would be edX or Coursera in this context, they would need to provide the code that allows them to reach out and make use of these various LTI tools. Both edX and Coursera have already done the lifting on the tool consumer side of things, although that hadn't been true in 2013. We were working with Coursera engineers right up until the day of course launch to make sure that they could use our LTI integration. I think that as the LTI standard has matured and more folks have integrated this into their tools, implementation keeps getting easier because folks keep publishing mechanisms and toolkits for implementing. So I think at this point, adding on the necessary bits to a reasonably well-architected system to allow you to be a tool provider is relatively simple. I mean, it requires some software development, it requires a little bit of engineering, but it's not the lift that it was even 2 years ago. Part of the trick, though, is in making effective use of LTI, and I think a lot of this really falls back on the user experience side of things. It's very easy to just throw in an LTI link that suddenly sends students off somewhere else, and this leaves them confused, doesn't make a strong connection with wherever their original consumer platform had been. And so thinking carefully about how this experience gets integrated into these larger platforms has been pretty important, and has been one of the things that impacts student completion on the LTI side. That said, this does give you the freedom to not have to integrate completely, right? You can maintain your own wrapper, maintain your own user interface metaphor. You just want to think a little carefully about making that boundary between the two a little more seamless. That answer your question? And I'm happy to dive a little more into the technical details, but and I think as we hit LTI 2.0, we're going to see a lot more useful information coming back on the data side, and that hasn't been the case to this point.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that's really important, is that a lot of people who build these things or who want to use them, they just want to use them, and then the data are not in a form, they're not neither communicated nor are they a useful form.
It's, see if I can go back on my obnoxiously long PowerPoint here. As I was saying, obnoxiously long. So this really was one of the challenges that we faced. Even with LTI, we've ended up with 4 distinct data sets, and we've ended up having to do an awful lot of work in matching students between these that becomes painful because of other IRB constraints and because of honest attempts to protect student privacy. Many of our data sets, by default, will anonymize on their own student identity, and needing to get them to back out that anonymization to say, no, first you need to match with some of these other data sets and then we can anonymize, has been a challenge because many of them were just never designed to deal with that. Who does that? Why would you build in mechanisms of your system to de-anonymize data, right? This is, it's just not what we do with learning data.
Yeah, hi, I just had a question about sort of the feedback loops between the data and instruction. Mm-hmm. So in K-12, I mean, there are tons and tons of these teacher dashboards that have been created. But the problem is that the teachers really don't know how to act upon the data because it's very dispersed. And I'm wondering whether that's been maybe better solved in higher ed, but how do you think about whether or not the sort of in the next lecture that the MOOC provider is giving, how are they taking into consideration the data that they've just received?
So I think that this is no different in higher ed than it is K through 12. One of the findings from the CCOLI study, on the one hand, was that one of the biggest influences on how students used the materials and succeeded was how faculty used these materials. But we also found that it's remarkably hard to integrate this stuff into your practice. Tom Cortina is a computer science faculty member at CMU. Been working with him on a CS course. And the first pilot that he ran, we built out this learning dashboard after we had worked with him to build out a course. He went out, he got in front of his students, gave them his original talk, sent them off to work through these modules, and then sat down with a member of our team to review the dashboard results. And we found that one of these outcomes the students still weren't getting, and he sort of got this puzzled look on his face. He said, the problem is I've already given you my best stuff. Like, what am I going to go in and tell these students? This really represents a fundamentally different model for approaching your classroom. It's not something that can easily be prepared far in advance. And I think that we're all still figuring out how to make use of these tools. However, we've seen faculty adjust to this and do it really effectively. And I think part of the trick is going to be capturing a larger body of knowledge on how do we rapidly change instructional strategies based on the kinds of feedback that these instruments can provide. That said, I wish I had a perfect answer for it, but I know it's possible, and we're still figuring out the best way to support faculty in making those transitions.
Yeah, just make a comment. We did a lot of this in mastering physics, or just generally in mastering chemistry stronger. And one of the things you really, really have to work out for, especially as you get away from physics or math professors, is, hey, graphs are not so easy to determine, to understand. I mean, I've seen demonstrations for enthusiastic faculty when the first question was, well, gee, I'd really like to know, the time distribution of my students. Well, hey, we just showed you these 4 graphs, and that was the first one in the top left, and you didn't get the message. And these are people who really want to learn. How you get the attention of people farther down the food chain who don't go to these meetings and don't go to these workshops in a way that they can look at it so quickly that they not only have actionable data, but that they see immediately that an action is needed is a huge problem. And it's also an acknowledged problem in the psychometrics community. How we got all this stuff, how do we display it?
And I think part of this is also a challenge of incentives. So I think really drilling home the notion that being able to adapt your instructional strategies in this way leaves you walking into the classroom and engaging with your students in a way that really does draw upon your expertise, that you're not covering the same kinds of things over and over again, but instead you can build an instructional experience that's going to be more satisfying and valuable for you as an instructor, not just for the learner. Because something needs to motivate the engagement with these tools and then the move away from business as usual. And part of it's user interface, part of it's incentive, though.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the question that you raised as on your last slide. You don't need to go back to it. About possible metrics of success and engagement, what is going on in the course. And it's really challenging, especially, so one example of a challenge is the dropout, because if you use a pre-test and a post-test, you might see that there are fewer people in the post-test than you had in the pre-test. And usually those people who actually answer the post-test are not a random sample of the people who answer pre-test, but the ones who were as successful to get to the end and complete that test at the end, right? So it's probably an overestimate by far, from what I've seen, of what you would actually get, because all of these other people have already dropped out or got too frustrated. And that is a big challenge for coming up with metrics that are actually measuring what we want to measure without inducing biases. Also, when we run experiments, the only metric that you can really look at when you run an experiment in a MOOC and you give people 2 conditions over time is dropout, because that is the thing that does not change with the population that you're measuring if you're measuring continuously. Say you want to measure cognitive load in a MOOC over time. Well, the people who might experience high cognitive load, cognitive overload in one condition will drop out faster, most probably. You don't even know that for sure. But if you try and compare by week 5, your populations are very probably not alike anymore. And so the comparison will be biased. So it is very hard because of dropout. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas on that.
Well, and even beyond just dropout, one of the other challenges that we saw in CCOLI is our various protocols did not allow us to include pre- and post-test as any part of the grade. We couldn't incentivize inside of the course. And so students were taking the pre- and post-test simply to win a chance to win an iPad. And it shows when you read some of these exams. I mean, students would just go in and push submit on, and so I know that my post-test data is pretty horrendous. 2 areas that have been exciting, but that are very, very early stage, and you saw this in some of the slides. One is that we do have some models that are producing learning estimates, and I think as we gain greater comfort with those, and as we build out some of the models for producing them, these are going to give us some clearer measures for comparison. The second is I think that at least looking at population to population and course version to course version, there's a lot to be said for using the learning curves that are coming out of PSLC's data shop. Again, it gives me some kind of standard measure for comparison, at least looking at those students that have engaged with the activities. As you note, the dropout question here is going to continue to be a challenge, but I think that selection bias in MOOCs is just something that we have to recognize is going to be there, right? I mean, these are students that are voluntarily entering the MOOCs to begin with, and I don't have a perfect answer for that. But if we're willing to take their engagement with the activities and what this seems to say about how well they're learning against a specific knowledge component or outcome, it gives us something to start with.
I just want to make sure we are careful when making causal claims, especially when we try to implement experiments in light of these clear selection problems.
No. I mean, we've got to be aware of it walking in the front door. So.
Can I just make a comment about that? I really think that the dropout problem, the attrition problem, is a 2-component problem, and that's not recognized. Are you a professor?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, for a lot of people here are professors, and you know that when you teach an elective course, then you know that the kids are trying out a couple different elective courses the first week. And they may drop out. They may put even the first assignment, but they don't do the second assignment. Now, in the MOOCs, of course, this thing is widely, in addition to being elective, it's widely publicized, and in addition to that, it's non-credit, effectively, not useful degree credit. And so, really, if you divide, and I've looked at a lot of these attrition curves, if you ask yourself how many people who were passing or who made significant effort on the second assignment finished the course, the MOOCs that we've run at MIT in my group, but at other ones at MIT that I've studied, always above 50% of the people who make a serious attempt on the second assignment get certificates. And we've seen up to 75%. So from that, you just ignore this big fall off. I mean, a quarter of the people never register and never.
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
One in the course.
Renee does
Then I
research in
think
that area.
I have a paper on that,
That's his
and
area of
it's
research.
absolutely true. The number of people who enroll is like clicking a like button on Facebook. That's what it means. The publicity works, right? But whether people actually engage. But even then, if they have submitted a first assignment,
Then there's a lot of bias.
Then there's a lot of bias
I don't
still,
disagree
yeah.
with that.
And we took a similar approach in that first set of dropout graphs, that we ignored anyone that did nothing more than enroll. I mean, that's our starting population were those that had engaged in some way. Good,
Hey, Norman.
hey.
So I'm going to change the subject slightly. One of your questions, one of the challenges had to do with IRB. And so I'm interested if you could talk a little more about what those challenges were particularly. And
I could talk all day on that
yeah,
subject.
I mean, not in too much detail, but I've sat on IRBs before, and so I'd like to think a little more deeply about what challenges you actually saw. And I mean, it is a big, I don't want to call it a barrier to research because it's so important, but it does pose logistical challenges, especially across universities, things like that. And so it's an important discussion that I don't think we have enough of. And it impedes, research because people are either afraid of it or they don't want to deal with it or don't know how to deal with it.
So I think that one of the single largest barriers to this is that we do not have norms for educational research and educational data specifically that align well with IRBs that have been developed to protect against what is essentially medical research, right? I mean, we've got this notion of a need for sharing of learner data that is comparatively low risk, but we don't have norms for understanding this. And so in many ways, each IRB is forced to go it alone as they evaluate what's the relative risk, who's getting access to this. So this is one piece. And we're further burdened by the regulatory aspect. I think that FERPA in particular is poorly understood, but is often plugged into these issues in ways that is not productive. One of the ways to address this, I think, is on this norm establishment. And I think the work that happened at Asilomar, to asilomar-highered.org, the recent gathering, to really drill in on this question of how do we establish some principles for treating this learning data as a public good and being able to share it in more effective ways. Beyond better norms, we need to figure out how IRBs across institutions can work together. They weren't designed to do this. And I mean, again, I can go off all day on nightmare stories, but let me just two pieces. So I'm very fortunate in that I have an IRB protocol for OLI generally, anything that happens inside of the system in which my students consent or opt into the research process. I'm at fairly significant liberty to make use of that data and to share it with other researchers that will register as an OLI researcher. Within CCOLI, we had something like 27 community colleges that were involved, and because there was work happening outside of the system, we needed a separate protocol. My IRB determined that we actually needed to get IRB approval from each of the individual 27 community colleges, who are not equipped in many cases to deal with these types of questions, right? I mean, they often don't have the infrastructure, and so approval ranged from someone in a provost's office sort of sending me an email saying, yes, this is fine, to a full-on IRB review. For, again, what was for something that if I had not been calling it research, but if instead each of these individual faculty members had chosen to use these instructional materials in pre and post test as part of their instruction, they were completely at liberty to do. So figuring out how we can work well together in that space. On the Georgia Tech side, there was actually an awful lot of challenge in Georgia Tech's IRB, who it wasn't clear had a perfect understanding of what was being collected for this specific MOOC, and who had issued a blanket protocol across all 5 of the MOOCs that were happening inside of Gates, but all with the assumption that the only researchers that were going to be involved would be those at Georgia Tech. And so when we started introducing additional researchers, it created some challenges for them that we ended up moving around essentially by having our researchers added to their protocol. So I'm effectively a Georgia Tech researcher now. And this created certain interesting absurdities. So Joel Smith is one of the original contributors or founders to OLI at Carnegie Mellon. Joel is really respected, really knows his stuff, and Joel is so senior to me that I would hesitate to go and ask Joel for anything. And so needing to go approach Professor Dr. Joel Smith and explain to him that I needed him to repeat his human subjects training because of this protocol that was off somewhere was an uncomfortable conversation, right? A combination of norms around data sharing with at least some more thoughtfulness about how we conduct cross-institutional research in this space would go a long way to removing some of these burdens. Some better standards for risk and dealing with that risk, I think, would also be helpful.
So, question that's a bit related. I wonder if you could expand on the collaborative activities that were done in the MOOC and in OLI, and perhaps whether or not there's something that's measuring peer-to-peer work and student-to-student interaction and what impact that has on learning and effectiveness.
I cannot speak much to the collaborative activities. So within the psychology course, we actually, on the OLI side, do not have any collaborative work. One of the next projects that we've identified has been to build out more authentic collaborative activities into the OLI system, something that Carol and I are hoping to work on. Within the MOOC, the collaborative activities took 2 forms. There were some discussion forum questions that, aside from Carolyn's review, not a lot of digging has been done on. And there was also a requirement early in the course for peer review and feedback and grading of papers. And so the students rebelled against this in a way that I'm continue to be surprised by. I mean, they reacted very strongly to this notion of grading one another, of having grades come in from other students on their work, and essentially refused to participate.
Against the faculty grading as a component of that exercise?
They never got to that point. They were going to be, but they never reached that point. Less than 100 students participated in the first activity, and I believe less than 20 in the second, and they never bothered with releasing the third. And it seemed like there was a number of students that were very vocal in their opposal to this that engaged the rest of the students in this strike, essentially. They weren't going to do these activities.
Community college students or the general MOOC population?
This was the general MOOC population.
Wow, so there's really no stakes involved. I mean,
exactly, yeah. What's the risk in this case? My understanding is something I didn't reference much, but that was my third comparison, were students that were taking this at an R1 institution using the MOOCs and OLI and face-to-face instruction. They obviously did engage in these activities, but I don't have access to that data because it's not included under the MOOC IRB. Sorry, I feel like that was a very unsatisfying answer to your question, but that's where we landed. Other questions?
Since you saw the students' comments about refusing to participate in the further assignments, what did they cite as their answers? Did they give any kind of insight into what they were unhappy about?
So if I were going to categorize it, there were some students that felt that having other students review their work did not take into account some of their own special circumstances. There were others that just felt that their peers should not be evaluating their work and that they did not feel confident in having their peers evaluating their work. And there were others that I just don't have a good sense of what was going on.
Did that break down by educational level? Like it seemed that the dominant number of people in your study in the MOOC already had their PhDs. Were it the people that already had their PhDs that were refusing to have their work peer reviewed?
So it's a great question, and I haven't taken that sort of deep dive, but it's an interesting one. Other questions? So philosophically, I've got one for you that every time I look at my demographic breakdown, it keeps coming back to me. Georgia Tech invested a great deal of time and talent in this effort, as did OLI, and the Gates Foundation put a non-trivial amount of funding into this course and into some of the subsequent research. And this was an awful lot of resource to be devoted to what was essentially a population of folks that had master's degrees and PhDs. And it feels irresponsible to me to not ask, was this a good use of that resource? How do we better target these kinds of learning experiences towards the students that need them? How do we really identify and target appropriate learner populations? Around 2000, I think, I spent about a week and a half experimenting with day trading. It was the end of the 90s, everybody was doing it. So I got this distinct recollection of sitting in this chat forum with other day traders, and some stocks started going up, and we all started getting excited about this. Oh, I'm buying into this, I'm buying into that. And finally, some experienced day trader, he'd been at it 2 weeks, popped in and said, "Are you guys selling to each other?" And suddenly all of the traffic on the stocks stopped, just dead stopped. So how do we stop selling to each other, particularly in an introduction to psychology MOOC, where we know that there are students that need this? How do we better get this information out to them? And I don't have an answer to that one. I think that's a much bigger question.
I was just going to say, I think Ed Cottrell's group at Microsoft Research India has been doing some great work working with the third-tier engineering colleges in India, and their idea was to use MOOCs as a resource, but to work with the teachers to help them see how they could use it in their course. And I think if we want, to target particular populations, we're going to have to do the same on-the-ground work. I think we like to sit at our desks and just do the technology and put it out there and let somebody use it, but I think we really have to do the professional development. We really have to do that on the ground. Partnering in order to get it out there where, in the populations that we want to use it.
Yeah, I guess my answer was similar. So, yesterday at one of the lightning rounds, there were speakers, I think it was the teaching lightning round. There were faculty from Mission Bay Community College, which is near here. And they used a MOOC, but in describing what they did, and then when I spoke with them afterwards, they essentially used the MOOC, but really what their students were using were all of the activities that their faculty had developed to go with the MOOC, because the MOOC, the way it was designed, just was not supporting their learners. And I probably shouldn't say what they said, because I don't know if they want it publicly said, but suffice it to say that a good deal of the learning activities that were being effective with their learners were the learning activities that they contributed, not what was thrown over the wall. So I guess my answer to your question, and we did this all the time in CCOLI, was engaging a much greater diversity of faculty in the development from the beginning to, if you want these resources to be, and also some of the people from your target population from the beginning, if you want these resources to be used by some target population. So
the question that comes to mind how do we reach our target audience? How do we get high school students and even undergraduates to do this? The question I think we should be asking is, what incentive do these people have to do this? I mean, there's a lot of incentive if you're in the workforce and you have a specific question, or you're a motivated self-learner, for sure. But when you're in the throes of 16 credits an undergraduate institution, if there's not a big incentive for doing this, I wouldn't have done it. And I consider myself a lifelong learner. I wouldn't have done it as a graduate student. I would not have I didn't do it. There were classes MOOCs I should have probably taken as a grad student, but I did not have the time or the resources to give to it, even though I knew it was good for me. And this is a tough question.
I was talking specifically about using the MOOC resources in formal education where the students are.
Which incentivizes it.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're talking about is there's incentive, there's credit, there's something there.
Some sort of incentive structure, credentialing process. Yeah.
But this question of context, I think, is really, really important. I'm from the University System of Maryland, and we recently engaged in the Ithaca study that repurposed MOOCs for use in credit-bearing courses. And one of the big findings was the students were fairly dissatisfied with their MOOCs because it didn't fit their context. You know, if you're a student that's attending an HBU, you're there for a reason. You relate to those faculty, or if you've gone to Frostburg to connect with a particular faculty member. You know, when we take these materials and repurpose them, we have to be really careful about the context. I think that's a big piece of it.
Well, just let me ask one question. Why are the commercial publishers so successful in getting people to use their stuff?
You're talking about like the Pearson products and things along those lines, or are you talking about textbooks?
Yeah. I mean, well, for example, my son and I made Mastering Physics. And it's a tutorial system, and it has a library of problems, and 400,000 people use it. I mean, that's 10 times as many as bought the most popular book. So it's out there. And so is it the trust? Is it the support? Is it the imprimatur of some publishing company? Is it the young person who comes by and talks to the professor and says, you know, here's my card, here's my cell phone on it in case you have trouble? I mean, where are we relative to that, and how do we get there?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but I think this social connectedness and some of the affect is definitely a big part of that. So when we now have students that are watching videos of faculty members, there's a social component to that, and an interactive component that feels very different and feels like I don't necessarily belong now to that discussion. And I think as we move into these kinds of materials that we're going to see more and more of those kinds of reactions to some of these sorts of things. I don't know. I don't have the complete answer.
So I can speak to some adoption studies that we did with faculty, looking and a big part of the so what are the factors that would make a faculty member in traditional higher education willing to adopt activities that are designed outside? One of them is it has to definitely be something that they believe is something that they couldn't have created better themselves. And part of what Pearson has going for they've got a huge sales force that is out there. And if you look at what Pearson's offering, these large textbooks with lots and 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 lots of problems that most of the things that we're creating don't have that because just the scale of things. But so, where is it going? So they have to trust the provider. They have to trust that it's effective. It has to be something that they believe they couldn't have done on their own. And having someone else that they trust who's used it is huge. And so, yeah, those are the big things. And it has to all. So I'm going to get a little soapboxy here. There's a challenge here because part of what we're trying to do, at least what we were always trying to do in OLI, was not just create tools that supported the way that teaching and learning currently happens. OLI was in some ways or continues to be a Trojan horse of trying to change the teaching and learning practice, to move it more towards an evidence-based practice. So designing the environments with what we know about human learning, and then having people use those environments in real classrooms, collecting the data from what's working and not working, where your students' knowledge state is, and expecting faculty to look at that data to make different decisions about what they do in class. That's a real change in practice. So, and there's not enough support in the existing education system to support faculty, I think, to undergo that change in practice. I mean, we look at our students and we recognize that in students trying to learn a new skill and a new practice, they need support, scaffolding, all of that kind of stuff. And so if we think about the faculty as the students, and we're just saying, okay, now we're supposed to take the way you've taught things for the last 15 years and overnight figure out how to incorporate this completely different approach, this data, and, you know, and do it differently. That's an absurd thing to be asking of our faculty.
Could I just add one quick thing to that? That's you know, as I look at dashboards like this and think about faculty's reaction to them, it's like anything else. They don't have the underlying theory to be able to interpret that. So if I don't know that immediate feedback, you know, the fact that I waited 2 weeks to give feedback on the quiz was really not a good thing from a theory standpoint. I'm not going to know how to interpret this. So the more that we can build that kind of scaffolding, we've heard it several times the last couple of days, the more we can build that kind of scaffolding in for faculty so that they can begin, I call it hiding the broccoli and the mashed potatoes, the Trojan horse sort of thing, so they can begin understanding how to interpret these data, I think that will help tremendously. I agree.
And that's time. Thank you all for attending. I have great big piles of data if anyone wants to dive in and start figuring out some other ways to evaluate learning with me. Thanks.